afternoon to one of the final portions of what had been planned as a springtime final showcase for this was the Humanities Informatics Lab, and that was one of the strategic initiative funds from the Provost's office that went to a bundle of humanities groups. And we were just one lab, but it was nice, substantial funding for 3 years. This has been an interdisciplinary series of talks, workshops, and courses uniting, and one of the things I like especially about it, really a wide range of departments and even schools and faculty, staff, and students, asking a whole range of questions. The relationship between human culture and technology, the circulation and control of information. We've had readings, we've shared research, and studied how to learn more about AI, drones, algorithmic bias, facial recognition, the history of information and concepts of data, all sorts of interest in how things are mediated, emerging methods of data collection and analysis, and broadly speaking, why we should all be very scared, the ethics of information as technology seems to be racing towards the singularity. So what does it mean to be human in the age of information when we are running into our boundaries of the Anthropocene and of species? Can we keep up with the consequences of smart environments, neural networks, the digitization of millennia of texts and cultural heritage? So there were 4 working groups. 2 of them have already presented their final showcase, human machine intelligence and surveillance and infrastructure. I know Phil is going to also remind you of, this is a full afternoon, smart environments at 4 p.m. led by Mona El Kafif and Gina Ripple of architecture. And then there will be a keynote lecture, which really, when he says, it's called data autographies, and that just, it's like a dog whistle to me. I'm really fascinated by the idea. So Dietmar Offenhuber, Associate Professor of Northeastern University, will give the final keynote for the final showcase. So all events are freely accessible, and as you signed up for this, go to ihgc.virginia.edu/events, and you'll be able to register for those final 2 sessions this afternoon to get the Zoom link. We planned this session to be about pedagogy well before the pandemic. As Brandon Walsh notes in the essay that you were invited to read beforehand, which I think is getting to be in the chat at some point, Brandon Walsh's forthcoming essay, The Futures of DH Pedagogy in a Time of Crisis. I like the way he says, educators worldwide face, quote, how we can teach without killing our students and each other. And you can substitute some other verbs in there for teach. All the more we hear digital pedagogy in the air, and I just recently got an email, learn more about digital pedagogy, and we're talking about digital humanities pedagogy. Is there a difference? I think there's a big difference from the kerfuffle over MOOCs and distant learning, say 8 years ago, I think, but we can talk about that. So let me introduce the moderator, Phil Trella, who's really been instrumental in pulling this panel together. We have a respondent, Jitna Ferdewijk, who will get introduced in his turn. But in the meantime, we're all planning to do short talks. So Phil Trella is Associate Vice Provost and Director of the Office of Graduate and Postdoctoral Affairs. In his role, he leads and coordinates institutional efforts in graduate education and postdoctoral training, and has worked on a variety of student-centered initiatives around interdisciplinary research and training, education, career, and professional development. Most recently, the exciting PhD Plus Phil's academic background is in anthropology and archaeology, and he maintains a strong interest in digital humanities, including DH approaches to pedagogy and public engagement. So thanks, Phil, for moderating.
Well, thanks very much for asking me. I was really honored to be invited to the session, first of all, and asked to moderate. There is a bit of a focus, I know, with all things at DH at UVA, so many awesome opportunities for graduate students to interact and to get involved in both what's happening in DH and the broader community. And so I think that'll also be kind of a theme in terms of this pedagogy. When we're thinking about pedagogy, it's not just what we're doing with undergraduates in the classroom, but it goes beyond the classroom, beyond undergraduates, including graduate students, and also other students as well, as I think Brad's going to talk about in his talk about today a bit too, ways that DH inflects upon and builds upon and impacts pedagogy in so many different contexts. So I'm really happy to have the opportunity to serve as moderator for this session, for this really timely and stimulating panel of talks, which we titled Emergency, Digital Humanities Pedagogy, with some focus on the emergent and the emergency that we all feel that we're kind of living in right now. As Allison mentioned, this is the final event of the Network-Corpus working group, which was led by Brad Pasanek, one of our speakers, and another of our speakers, Rennie Mapp. The activities of the group are most nearly aligned with the field that we know today as digital humanities, or DH as we call it. As Allison was mentioning, the workshops have ranged from social networks to reading group discussions on digital textual studies, to visiting lectures on search functions and image recognition and archives, as well as interactive exhibits of the puzzle poetry group. For this final roundtable, the group chose to emphasize pedagogy, an intentional choice that will contribute to both the challenges and the opportunities of our present time, and that sets the stage for what is to come when current instructional modes are no longer a necessity, but in some circumstances could remain a choice, right? So we recognize in these panels that our current context is evolving and changing all the time, and that eventually this pandemic will pass, but we will be left with many opportunities to think in new ways about digital humanities pedagogy and pedagogy in general. So the presentations that you'll hear today will focus on courses and curricula relating to big data or DH methods in literature and the arts, crises in the humanities higher education, opportunities for cultural critique with and of technology, and other aspects of the collaborative projects made possible by the working group. To help frame the discussion today, we have encouraged all of our participants to read Brandon Walsh's excellent essay, The Futures of Digital Humanities Pedagogy in a Time of Crisis. If you haven't already read Brandon's work, don't worry, we're not going to have a quiz today, but if you are interested in perusing it, we have uploaded it into the chat box so that you can also find it there. Not surprisingly, Brandon's work focuses, as I said, on the future of graduate education and pedagogy in that context. And that's a subject which, of course, we share a deep passion for and have the opportunity to discuss whenever we can. So along those lines, I also wanted to take a moment and the opportunity here today to remind all of our participants, including our graduate students and our faculty, especially our graduate students, of the excellent opportunity that is available to our students all across the university to engage in digital humanities, and the graduate certificate in digital humanities, which I know Rennie Mapp was really integral in getting off of the ground. So please do check out those opportunities, and we of course encourage you to engage in any way, and especially with the certificate, which is just a great opportunity. So I'm going to talk a little bit now today about the structure of the event, the order of our presentations, and sort of the flow of what we're looking at for the next 90 minutes or so. In terms of the order, you will hear from the following speakers in this order of presentation. First, we will hear from Rennie Mapp, who is the project manager for strategic digital humanities initiatives and co-leader of the Network-Corpus research group. Her talk is titled "Information is Virtual: The Informatics of Network-Corpus Events." Our second speaker will be Brandon Walsh, who is the head of student programs at UVA Scholars Lab, and his work is on the intention in care, values, pedagogy in the DH community. Our third speaker will be Brad Pasanek. Brad is the Mayo NEH Distinguished Professor of English and also co-leader of the Network-Corpus Research Group. Brad will talk about his presentation, NEH Professorship and Puzzle Poetry. Our fourth speaker will be Eleanor Newman, doctoral candidate in art and architectural history. The title of Eleanor's presentation is Practicing Decolonial DH Inside and Outside of the Classroom. And last but not least, we will hear from Allison Booth, professor of English and co-director of the Humanities Informatics Lab. The title of Allison's talk today is When Data and Cultural Heritage Are Daily News, Online DH Teaching. So that's the lineup of presentations. Directly following those presentations, you will hear some brief reflections and perhaps a question or two from our colleague, Jitna Ferdiwek, who has been very kind to join us today. He is, of course, in the midst of a very busy fall. Jitna is instructional designer in the College of Arts and Sciences Learning, Design, and Technology group. So Jitna has been very active in these last several months in thinking through all these issues, and I think is the actual perfect respondent to offer us some reflections and some questions on the talks that you are about to hear. In terms of the flow event, as I said, our speakers are going to follow one right after the other. We are not going to pause between speakers for questions, but rather we are going to wait until the end to take questions as a whole after we hear all the presentations and after Jitna's reflections. I welcome you to use the chat feature to enter your questions during the talks. It may make more sense for you to hold on to those questions, though, until you hear from all of the speakers, because we are drawing some relationships between the talks, right? And you might have questions that are kind of, impacted by all of the talks, but you're, of course, welcome to enter your question into the chat at any time. Although the goal of our event today, of course, is to spark lots of discussion, we anticipate that the papers their presentations will be about 8 to 10 minutes each at max. And so we have left plenty of time on the table for discussion at the end. Having said that, we would ask you to withhold from using the chat feature to have a lot of discussion during the presentations or kind of side discussions so as to not distract the speakers and presenters, but there'll be plenty of time at the end for you to ask your questions. If we are not able to get to any of your questions during the session today in the 90 minutes that we have together, we will absolutely connect them to the speakers who can engage with you, as I like to say, offline but online, because everything is, of course, I'm not sure what it means to say, I'll get back to you offline these days, but whatever that means, that's what we will try to do if there are any questions on the table that we're not able to get to together in our talk today. Just as one final note, for those who may have been kind of drifting in as we were giving the preliminaries, this panel is part of the overarching Humanities and Informatics Lab final showcase. And if it leaves you wanting more, as Allison said at the top, there is the Smart Environment Showcase will be at 4:00 p.m. today. And I've shared that link also in the chat box with you so that you can access it there. Okay, that gets us through the top. Now we're ready to actually get to providing you some of these excellent presentations. So without further ado, we will get started with our first speaker, Rennie Mapp. I will offer a brief introduction of all of our speakers before they get started. Rennie Mapp is the project manager for strategic digital humanities initiatives in the Office of the Vice President for IT and the Dean of the Library, as well as administrative director of the Graduate Certificate in Digital Humanities. Her scholarly interests lie in both 19th century literature and in the intersection of culture and technology. With Brad Pasanek, she co-leads the Network-Corpus working group of the Humanities Informatics Lab at the IHGC. She has a PhD in English literature from UVA and a master's in IT management from the McIntire School of Commerce. Rennie, over to you.
So I'm sharing my screen. Can everyone see now?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So I want to speak on the workshops that we have, the various workshop models that we have implemented through Network-Corpus. It's been a great opportunity, and I'm very grateful to the Humanities Informatics Lab, IHGC, Deb Johnny, Allison, Jack. It's been a great opportunity for me. I have to confess that I had a very weird reaction to medical procedure this week. So if I'm a little less connected in what I say, please feel free to ask questions at the end and be a little bit forgiving. So my thinking about these workshops started in part with some readings that Jack Chen and others proposed. It took me to a tutorial by James Stone on information theory. And he refers to Claude Shannon's 1948 essay, A Mathematical Theory of Communication. And this does have to do with workshops, I hope you will see. So Shannon provides in this 1948 essay on information theory that is tied to the general themes of humanities informatics that we've talked about over the last couple of years. Shannon provides a transformation in our understanding of information. Before his paper, information had been viewed as a kind of poorly defined miasmic fluid, but after the paper, it becomes apparent, and I'll question that word a little bit, but that information is a well-defined and above all measurable quantity. This is what I think that we're dealing with as humanists. This is one of the issues that we have to deal with when we try to learn how to use technologies, the technologies that digital humanists tend to approach humanistic topics with. Stone also says, what is information? It's what remains after every iota of natural redundancy has been squeezed out of a message. So I'm not sure humanists want to squeeze every iota of natural redundancy out of a message, but we still have to confront information theory when we are learning, how to code or just how to interact with digital technologies. Bruce Clark is probably my favorite essay that Jack Chen suggested in his very useful set of readings from the beginning of our Humanities Informatics Lab. And Bruce Clark, who actually used to be a member of the Shanana band that I believe was in Greece. It's a very funny connection, but he has a great media studies article that suggests that information doesn't exist until an observing system such as a mind constructs it, renders it as a virtual reality. It has no concreteness. It's a virtual structure, depends upon decoding regimes. And that's what I think our workshops are. They're decoding regimes where we can try to approach information through culture. So that's why I've been working with Brad and the other members of the Humanities Informatics Lab to try to think about how to grapple with virtuality through these decoding regimes of workshops, cultural experiences. How can we grapple with virtuality? This is Paul Vertaylor, who gave a great workshop at the beginning of my involvement in humanities informatics. So what are some questions that we can work through by re-examining workshop models? Workshops are a core part of digital humanities. It's been one of the greatest aspects of my involvement in DH, and it's one of the great things about DH organizations and DH affiliated organizations at UVA. And some questions that I've been able to start to work through by organizing various workshops through Humanities Informatics is, how do we help humanists overcome initial discomfort with tool interfaces? How do we avoid installation issues in a workshop by facilitating advanced installation? How do we follow up with participants after a workshop? And most importantly, how do we help humanists understand what is possible with technology? I don't have firm answers, but what I have felt really supported in is iterating answers to these questions, various ways to try to address these questions for humanists. Here are some of the workshops that we've had that have been sponsored by Humanities Informatics. JSTOR's development team came and gave workshops on both text analytics and involves Humanists in Usability. We had Giles Burgle from Oxford on computer vision, Catherine Bode on large corpus text analytics, Paul Bertaylor, as I mentioned, James English. And we did a week-long Python for Humanists workshop, co-sponsored with Research Computing. One way that has helped me think through what's possible for humanists and to kind of iterate these workshop models is to what I have described as an MAO diagram: materials, approaches, and outcomes. So helping humanists to see that what you start with, the materials you start with, that's on the left, goes through, you tend to take those through an approach. Maybe it's large scale analytics, maybe it's markup or text encoding, and then you have an outcome that can fit with standard scholarly modes or can be new and innovative. But it helps to think, you can work backwards. I want to have a digital exhibit, so perhaps I will use website creation, and it can include text, audio, data, video, maps, images, 3D, AR, VR. There can be you can have an approach that you want to start with and then see what kinds of materials you might use with that approach. But there are different ways to connect materials with outcomes, and they usually have to do with going through a technical approach. So this is one model that I've used. We have an upcoming Network-Corpus workshop that I want to mention before I get to the end, which is an iteration. So this process of iteration that's core to software development is also, I think, core to learning. It's just a different way of stating a kind of ancient epistemological truth that you need to work through things over and over again. So we're working through this workshop model, Python for Humanists 2.0. It's co-sponsored by Research Computing, and the main part of the teaching is offered by Jackie Huband of Research Computing. And it's managed this year by Logan Hyman, who works with me at UVA, and it's we're going to incorporate a new aspect, which is to help you get started if you're a participant in high performance computing, which I find very exciting opportunity. There are already at UVA, in addition to the Humanities Informatics, and I'm just winding up here, the Humanities Informatics workshops. There's Scholars Lab workshops. There are library research computing workshops, and this is the library research computing workshops, and this is the research computing workshop, so they're collaborating. And beyond UVA, there are DH workshops that have been so influential. The HILT, Humanities Intensive Learning and Teaching, that Brandon's been involved in. DHSI is sort of the venerable institution at the University of Victoria, run by Ray Siemens. The Oxford Summer Institute, which I've attended, which is wonderful. And the European Summer University in Digital Humanities at Leipzig. So these are part of the culture of DH. And I guess if I had to say one takeaway of the connection between workshops and digital humanities is how embodied, how material the experience of a workshop inevitably is. So the virtuality that humanists of the 20th and 21st century can't ignore, we still find ourselves in the classroom or on a Zoom call, but we're still interacting physically, and we have to think about not just the ways to deal with virtuality, but to make a good workshop, you have to deal with the physical aspects of the human experience as well. And I hope that I hope that soon we'll be able to go back to our workshop model, which involves delicious food, because I think that that's one of the most important material aspects of a good workshop. So I hope to see you all again soon in that material space. Thanks, Phil.
All right, excellent. Rennie, thanks so much. Okay, so let's see if you will bring your slides down. Great.
So it's me, right?
That's right. So,
Okay.
so our next speaker, yep, sorry, Brandon, I was working on.
I think you're on mute. Sorry.
Okay, there we go. I have to, when the screen switches, it comes back on, and I have to get back to my, document where I have your lovely introduction. So our next talk is by Brandon Walsh. Brandon is the head of student programs in the Scholars Lab at the University of Virginia Library. He works primarily at the intersections of digital pedagogy and digital humanities, and he serves on the editorial boards of the Programming Historian and the Journal of Interactive Technology and Pedagogy. Brandon, over to you.
Thanks. So I think you can hear me. Can you also see my slides? Yeah, cool. So thanks everyone for virtually coming. Thanks to Allison for suggesting that my piece might be relevant today, and thanks to any of you who read it. I sort of don't want to assume that everyone read it, so what I'll do today is just sort of quickly rehash the position from that, and then offer a couple examples of how we're working through this similar sorts of things in the Scholars Lab, which, as Phil was saying, I'm the head of student programs. So that piece of mine is forthcoming in a collection on the digital futures of graduate pedagogy in the humanities, I believe. So the gist of it is that my sense now, more than ever, is that this is a time where you have to choose sides in your teaching. So just with the current state of the world, state of the pandemic, the state of a system in which fair and equal representations are under threat by the state, a state in which there's a sort of carceral system that's brutally murdering and imprisoning Black Americans and acquitting their assailants. Like, it's hard to imagine teaching as business as usual right now for digital humanities, digital pedagogy, humanities, informatics, or otherwise. So what I argue there is it's a time for DH and its associated pedagogies to engage more radically in anti-racist, anti-racist, abolitionist pedagogies and pedagogies that are in pursuit of equity in general. So to amplify the work of scholars doing this work, scholars of color and women in particular, to engage our projects and administrative actions in the services of promoting a more just and equitable world and educational system, and to consider the role that pedagogy might play in all that. So Kathleen Fitzpatrick recently had a piece that was in reference to COVID-19 and universities returning to campus, titled "Your Institution Does Not Deserve to Survive." And the idea there for her was that an institution doesn't deserve to survive unless it is committed first and foremost to the people that make up and serve that institution. And I'm really interested in sort of provoking DH and DH pedagogy in the same way. So that's my fundamental question is, what is DH pedagogy doing to justify its own survival, to make it worth keeping and to help make the world a more equitable place? So that's the idea. Your DH and your DH teaching need to stand for something. So one space in which we've tried to think about these things for the Scholars Lab is in these documents called charters, which are intentional statements of values that emerge out of group discussion as a means of explicit and intentional value setting and community forming. So we've done them for the whole lab. You can find them on our website. We've also done them specifically for our student programs and for the Praxis program, which is a year-long collaborative fellowship for DH based around project-based pedagogy. So it's sort of like a syllabus of and for the soul, from the soul. It doesn't state things like absence policies, even though we're talking about students and teaching. Instead, it mentions things like, we trust you, we credit you, we'll learn from you as much as from us, you'll get frustrated working with us, but we're here for you. And it kind of tries to frame the work that we're doing with students as an essential form of community building and working together that they're a part of. So we bring our students into these conversations by trying to make these values explicit and encourage them to have them as well among themselves, because the Praxis program especially, it's a group of people doing this kind of work, so we want them to think about the values they bring to each other. Rhonda Grizzle is our project training specialist in the Praxis, or in the Scholars Lab, and she gives our Praxis students a workshop on charters every year. That's really great, and I'm happy to share more information about how she does that work. But the goal is to try and get them thinking about these kinds of values that they want to bring to their work, for their collaborative project, So each year, the students have produced these, and I've been given permission by the students, some of whom are in the call now, to share some excerpts from their charter with you. So the kinds of things they've been talking about as being important to themselves this year are things like checking in with one another, actively describing tangible rules for how to check in and actively support dialogue, leading with kindness instead of niceness, prioritizing community and humanity, knowing the full person. Also, that is a puppet, and I was explicitly told not to explain it, though, you know, in the interest of how I like to work with students, since they're on the call, I might have them do it if they want. But the point of this is that it's an activity that any group can take on that I think is worth doing. This kind of intentional, explicit values setting and values thinking. It helps students decide in particular what their group stands for, what it doesn't, how to act on these principles. And if DH pedagogy is going to meet this growing set of emergencies in the world, some of which were just beginning to happen, some of which were sort of long happening when I was writing that piece, I think intentional values like these are essential. So one of the things we try and do in the lab and with our students is connect values to practice and practice to values. So over the course of the year, the students work on a research project with us and with me. One of the units that they take on over the course of the year is a unit on digital pedagogy. And since this is a conversation about pedagogy, I thought I'd explicitly talk about this. So the students design teach to learn workshops. So the idea is that they learn something about DH, teach themselves about it, and then pilot ways in which they might teach it for other people on the team. So over the course of the unit, they'll learn something about a method, and everyone else on the team learns something about the methods of everyone else. And as part of that, I run a workshop on teaching values. It's sort of a mix between planning a workshop like logistically and also how to develop your own pedagogical identity. So sort of like helping them develop a teaching manifesto for themselves. The students work these out together and share them. There are a couple slides here that illustrate how I go through this activity in case you're interested in doing it yourself. So the idea is a lot of teaching happens, I think, to the moment, sort of reflexively. You do things because they seem to be like good ideas because you're trying to figure it out, right? And so these activities are meant to help students reflect on what they're already doing, think about what they care about and how they can bring a more intentional set of values to it. So I have them do some mind mapping, which is something, again, I drew from Rhonda and life design schools of training. So the idea is you put a single term at the center of your map, and then you chart outwards, you map outwards, free associations, words that link to that concept. So this is one from the book on Designing Your Life, which is about careers. So this person is talking about being outdoors. And so from outdoors, he connects to camping, tents, cooking, surviving, exercising, running. So I have the students do a version of this, but for teaching. And so they pick a term for themselves that's relevant to their teaching in some way and iterate outwards about different concepts that are related to it. And they circle things that are familiar or most important to them. And then at the end of it, they have a set of sort of their core principles. And then I connect that to a few timed writing exercises that I got from Sean Michael Morris, who will come up later on in this talk as well. And the idea is to have them free write in a way that's very uninhibited, except for the rules at the bottom, which are things like you're not allowed to judge yourself and you just have to keep writing different kinds of values, thinking, anxieties that they're bringing into the workshop as a way of trying to think through how their practice can be better informed by intentions and thinking. So I mentioned Sean Michael Morris. Central to my thinking is something that I get from him, though I'm sure he's not the only one to have said this. This idea that teaching and pedagogy don't just take place in the classroom, rather everything we do should be imbued with a sense of our pedagogy as a kind of lived thing, as an animating force behind our administrative decisions and our actions. So Sean Michael Morris calls this our pedagogical habitus. In the Scholars Lab, central values to this are things like community, care, and intention. It involves thinking about how students are an integral part of the community. They contribute to that community. They help to build it as much as we do. It's not a hierarchical mentor-pupil relationship. And the ways we think about students in the community building work that we do with them don't end in the classroom. So in some sense, I think this is easier for us being that we're in the library because a lot of the space that we work in and the work that we do doesn't happen in a class per se or in a classroom per se. So easier to think about how your actions that are pedagogical reverberate beyond architecture if you're not living in that architecture. And I wanted to mention especially one program, or a couple programs that are related to this idea, the sense of that we have, or that I have, that all the work that we're doing is pedagogical in some way, even if it's not explicitly the moment in the act of teaching. So one example of this is the LAMI program, which we collaborate on with Phil's office. It's a program for external undergraduates for underrepresented communities who are interested in applying to graduate school, though Phil can probably describe it better than I can. That's the description that I always give. So the Scholars Lab gives them an introduction to library research methods and DH, but we're also just there to help them try and figure out how to come live in this space, the space where they might be uncomfortable, where they might be harassed as they're going down the street. Like, it's hard to live in Charlottesville as a person of color. It's hard, especially to come to Charlottesville as a person of color only for a couple months with a whole bunch of strangers. And so we're kind of there helping them try and figure out how to live together. Not actually doing any of the logistics of living, but hopefully, you know, board games and lunches and things like that to help them find their way. And then another space in which we're trying to build an intentional sense of care for students and really center their concerns is the Chesapeake Digital Humanities Regional Consortium, which is a pretty new group. It's just been slow getting off the ground a couple years. I was involved with it last year, and I know, I think Rennie and Laura from the Scholars Lab are involved with it this year, and Sherry Brown. So the idea is, how can we slowly found and grow a DH community that not only centers student concerns, but especially those students who are underrepresented and underheard, so really advocates for their needs. So something that doesn't just help them develop into professionals, but also helps the profession develop into something that's worth having them. So I'd like to close, because this isn't really much time, I want other people to be able to talk, with just a quote from Jacqueline Wernimont that I always come back to from this event that she was on called What is a Feminist Lab? Symposium. So her quote is, "A lab can be a technology to survive the institutions we work in while we seek to transform them," end quote. And so I think the same can be true of DH teaching and the pedagogical process, right? They can be a way of finding your way through institutions that are toxic while you're seeking to transform them, but I think only if they stand for something. So yeah, so hopefully that gives you a sense of the provocation and also some activities that we do to try and help students think through them. But you know, I'll stop there.
Okay, well, Brandon, thank you very much for that excellent, inspiring talk. I always love hearing about what's happening within the DH community, and of course, what's happening within the Scholars Lab at UVA. Sorry about that. So our next speaker is Brad Pasanek. Brad is the current Mayo NEH Distinguished Teaching Professor in the English Department at UVA. He is the author of Metaphors of Mind, a dictionary, published by Johns Hopkins in 2015. His overlapping areas of study include 18th century literature and the digital humanities. His research and teaching focus on literary form and intellectual history, with a developing interest in fabrication, using laser cutters and 3D printing, especially in game studies. This semester, he is teaching a course about Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice, gift sets and TikToks, and another about literary critical games. He's at work when he can find time on a new book about Josephine Miles and the pre-digital digital humanities. Brad, thanks very much for coming to deliver your talk today, and over to you.
I said, thank you. So you can see my screen. I'm going to launch my slideshow, hopefully. There we go. Okay. Thank you, Phil, and thank you, Allison, and thank you, Karen, for putting all of this together. It's been a while since I've given a talk, and I've never given a talk in this particular medium, so it's exciting. I don't know. I feel like a scholar again, so it's nice to be here. So I'm going to talk about puzzle poetry here at UVA with Neil Curtis, a graduate student in English. I lead a group of grads, undergrads, staff. They're English majors, sort of CS students, digital humanists, and MFAs who've shown up from time to time. We're a group that turns poems into puzzles, and it sort of helps to see them, I guess, which is hard to do in this, in this particular medium. But they're, laser cut. Often we've made different kinds of puzzles, but laser cut puzzles out of different materials. The work that we're doing, I think of as a kind of open-ended pure research, or I don't know if this space that Brandon sort of mentions, its purpose is a space to go and play. maybe to relax from other agendas. So we're learning about structure and thinking, we're learning about structure and thinking about medium. If there's an overarching question, if there is a kind of research project here, the question is something like, what are poems made of? And what is the medium that could be isolated, right? If we study poetry, to struggle with one of our puzzles is to appreciate the stuff of verse, lineation and syntax, punctuation and vocabulary. But because we don't have a set agenda, we've serendipitously run up against all sorts of different questions, problems. We've needed to recruit people from all over the university. Maybe this past year before the pandemic, we had a CS professor, Nathan Brunel, and a number of his students helping us figure out how to run UVA's supercomputer, getting it to mull over an Elizabeth Barrett Browning poem, the poem, "How Do I Love Thee? Let Me Count the Ways." So we fed that sonnet to the machine, and it timed out after sort of running routines for 3 days. This was a kind of hard problem, a hard CS problem that we're still working on. I guess currently we're paused, but we hope to get back to it. That the sonnet baffled the supercomputer made me really happy. That CS students showed up and learned about the structure of sonnets. Likewise, is pleasing and gratifying. And I'll return to the question of like what happens when we use the supercomputer, like when the English department gets to use gets to run Ravenna routines. So our efforts also have had pedagogical results, which is why we're here. I think like that are clear, I guess, or explicit. So I've trained students on the laser cutters of the School of Architecture to fabricate poems, like to cut them out of different materials and engrave them. We've also we hosted a tournament called the Sonnet Games for English majors in our survey course, at which students compete in teams of 4 and they race against the clock to assemble these oddly shaped pieces of wood and acrylic into the poems that they've encountered earlier in the semester. We've also shared these puzzles at a summer camp. Let's see if I can get this to run. I forget there's sound. There's just sound in here. I'll let it run for a second. And we've done similar work with a local high school in Northern Virginia. We have people who've been involved in the group who've taken our puzzles into different spaces. I like especially the idea that this is a research activity which has it's invoked graduate student attention and yet somehow trickles down into the middle schools. So I guess part of what I want to talk about today is what we do, and then maybe we can think about the way in which this changes practice in pedagogy or praxis in pedagogy. What we've been up to date, I guess, is exploring the geometry of this sonnet. And I once showed one of our puzzles to a colleague of mine named Marshall Brown, and claimed proudly that it's an example of like hyperbolical formalism. And I was invested in this as an idea, and he looked at me kind of pityingly and pronounced it's more like sub-formalism. And I think that it was a cut, but I'll take it. I like it. I think what we are doing is aiming at something like beneath prosody at a lower level than we might normally in an English classroom. We're thinking about something that in the 18th century would be called quantity, something beneath even what I.A. Richards, the English critic, would have identified as mere sound, something he distinguished from rhythm or the skeleton, what he calls the skeleton on which the reader casts the flesh and clothing of sense and feeling. In one of these thought experiments, Richards rewrites a stanza of John Milton's "On the Morning of Christ's Nativity" for his students. This is a practice that I'm borrowing from his, or thinking about, in the context of his classroom. He translates the line, "Yea, truth and justice then will down return to man," into just these sound shapes. J. Druten, Sustin, Ben, Mildown, Ladurin, N. Obscuring the semantics on purpose, but getting his students to know something about how sound works. what Richard calls the skeleton or the purified dummy is a step, maybe one step away from the syllabification that we're interested in, or quantity that we're interested in when we attend to puzzle cutting. We, I guess, go farther than Richard's, stripping away even phonemes in order to just count syllables. So both Richard's sense of a purified dummy or these grids of syllables offer ways of identifying like laminate layers upon which a reader can impose her reading. Beneath sound is bare shape, which is where piecification, that's kind of term of art that we've invented, the drawing of boundaries around words takes place. And so, if you know Shakespeare's sonnet, you can kind of, I guess, project onto these, dots and dashes, the words that belong here. Again, the difference between our approach and Richard's is that our skeleton doesn't require an imagined vocal or sub-vocal performance that activates the rhythm of the poem. Our syllable grids, by contrast, present a kind of degree zero of poetic composition. And I think that's where I think I can bring students from different departments, faculty and grads from different departments together at this ground zero. In preparing our puzzles, we abstract from the sonnet form to this 10 by 14 grid of syllable squares. It's a kind of coordinate field of positions. This is a handout that we've brought into high schools and middle schools, getting students to map out a sonnet. Taking a hint from the Oulipo group, we set ourselves constraints in our puzzlings. You can cut all sorts of different ways, but one of the ways that we're interested in dissecting a poem is to use these shapes, these arbitrarily chosen shapes. They're called pentominoes. That is, we can cut the poem up in such a way that 5 syllables will appear on any piece, and we can also give ourselves the constraint that as we cut, we don't sever any words, so that on each piece there are words, whole words. This is where the computation comes in, and this is where we call upon our CS majors. What we're doing is matching tilings to these puzzles, finding where the words fit, how they've been packed together. We use what are walk back algorithms to place pieces together, overlaying them, checking to see if the edges of the pieces don't sever a multi-syllabic word. Whoops, I went the wrong way. So this is the kind of dummy fit to the puzzle. Excuse me. In several of our puzzle designs, we've attempted to divide the octave from the sestet, and we see both of those rectangles, right, as shapes that can be packed with our polyominoes. And this 6 by 10 sestet, right, a section of the poem traditionally associated with the answer given to the question in the octave of a sonnet, can be neatly packed with 12 unique free pentominoes, and this is one way of putting 12 pentominoes together. There are, in fact, 2,339 ways to pack 12 unique pentominoes together. There are 3 billion, or more than 3 billion, 3,386,001,688 ways to pack an octave with these shapes. And right, when you ask Ravanna to begin placing the pieces, this is how you get to the point where you time out after 3 days of computation. We were generating for Barrett Browning, as many solutions as we could. We wanted to know how many different ways there are to dissect her sonnet. It's a sonnet about, how, like counting, how do I love thee? Let me count the ways. And as a group for Valentine's Day, we wanted to sort of, answer that question and start making puzzles to give to, a puzzle you could give to your bae, I guess, right? Yeah, a puzzle poem, one of however many millions of solutions there are. We're still working, right? We're still working on this. As a result of imposing our polyomino shapes on lines of verse, our pieces stand out as new bits of diction, and I like the ways in which these can then be put back together into new poems. For the Histo Remix event last year, we cut many poems up into the same, at the same scale, and let students mix pieces. So the blue would be from one poem and the yellow from another, and we let them construct new poems. These bits, are interesting to me as a kind of like new piece of language. This is from a Shakespeare poem, but it's not something that Shakespeare wrote. He didn't write A Mighty or Tyrant. He wrote something else. But we've got a new bit of Shakespearean vocabulary. Here's another from Barrett Browning, a kind of, we call these pentomemes. little bits of language that are saying something new. They've been rescued from a poem, but they're saying something else. Okay, so conclusion. I like the charge of saying something important here, maybe even being brash. So here's my provocation if we're going to have a conversation. This effort, for all its anachronistic reliance on computation and laser cutting, I believe comes quite close to the mentality of early modern composition. And I think as an English professor, this is what I'm invested in. This is the piece that's not, necessarily digitally, it's not necessarily a digital humanist thing. I'm interested in the way that language fits to the line, the way that rhyme, sits in space, and how terms are balanced. And our puzzles manifest this, poetry as a kind of toy medium. They look like, they make poems visible as mosaics, as marquetry or tiling problems. And that's the way, in the classical moment, in the neoclassical moment of the 18th century, that's the way poets thought about poetry. We make then literary history available to our CS students, and we make it kind of patent, tactile for our English majors. And we do something else when we bring them both together. We show them that quantity and quality, or numbers and words, those the squishy and crunchy, these are false dichotomies, and we can work together on these questions and these research problems. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. Yeah, absolutely fascinating. Okay, I'm sure we're getting to a point where we have where people are starting to stock up their questions. As a reminder, you're welcome to use the chat feature whenever you want to start putting your questions in there. But I think we're probably drawing some connections between some of these talks in some interesting ways. So let's keep it going. So our next speaker is Eleanor Newman. Eleanor is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Art, studying the intersection of landscape, gender, and empire in British art and visual culture of the long 18th century. Following her Praxis Program Fellowship in the Scholars Lab, she began collaborating on a digital story map for the exhibition Madayin, 8 Decades of Aboriginal Bark Painting from Yirrkala, Australia, organized by the Buku Larngay Mulka Art Centre, Australia, and the Kluge-Ruhe Aboriginal Art Collection at UVA. Eleanor, feel free to correct anything that I just butchered in your title. It's always an adventure when you're presented with someone's work in that way. Okay, Eleanor, you're on.
All right, and I'm just sharing my screen instead of my PowerPoint, but we'll just do that here. All right, can everyone see my PowerPoint? Okay, great. And sorry, Phil, for making you pronounce all of those Aboriginal Australian words. You did a wonderful job. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Eleanor, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Monacan people, the traditional custodians of the land that many of us in this virtual meeting physically occupy here in Virginia, and by paying respects to their elders past, present, and future. I've come to understand that such acknowledgements are vital, not just when discussing topics related to Indigenous communities, which is when they're primarily spoken aloud, but as critical reorientations both within the academy and the world. When I read about how just this year in 2020, the mining firm Rio Tinto destroyed caves that are sacred to 2 Indigenous Australian clans, the Puntu Kunti Kurama and the Pinakura, it was painfully clear once again that these are not token statements. Perhaps if settlers were to fully acknowledge Indigenous Australians as the traditional custodians and legally grant them land rights, these echoes of colonial violence in Australia would be less frequent than they are today. As students and teachers, scholars, and collaborators who are engaging with the digital, we have a responsibility to amplify the voices of those struggling within the field to #TransformDH and to practice, when possible, what Rupika Risam has described as a decolonized digital humanities that helps to overturn rather than reinforce colonial power structures by what she says, centering epistemologies and ontologies of Indigenous communities and the Global South. While others have spoken today from their positions as educators, I'll speak to my personal experience as a student. Risam's scholarship has greatly influenced my thinking, but the most influential dialogues for me took place not in the formal classroom as such, but in what Brandon Walsh in the essay he suggested, or we all suggested you come having read today, as these sort of interstitial university spaces. That could be something like the Scholars Lab, the Kluge-Ruhe Aboriginal Art Collection, the Mapping Indigenous Worlds Lab, the Humanities Informatics Lab. And all of these spaces are ones in which my fellow graduate students and I joined in critiques of our work with colleagues, professors, visiting lecturers, curators, and librarians. The reason I think these experiences were so fruitful is because they resulted from an intentional and critical pedagogy through which we approach theory and practice as mutually constitutive rather than binary. During a seminar in the spring of 2018, taught by the Kluge-Ruhe's curator, the fantastic Henry Scarrett, 8 other graduate students and I curated the exhibition Beyond Dreamings, the Rise of Indigenous Australian Art in the United States. And we also published an exhibition catalog. As part of the 2018-19 Praxis program, my cohort and I collaboratively designed and built a digital project with guidance and encouragement from Brandon Walsh and every wonderful person in the Scholars Lab. And in order to demonstrate what could be done with material newly released into the public domain in the US, we created a variety of digital interventions in Robert Frost's 1823 collection of poetry called New Hampshire. And some of our interventions attempted to address his erasure of Abenaki peoples of the northeastern United States from his text. While working on each project, my colleagues and I had the opportunity to dialogue with experts such as the Aboriginal Australian curator John Mundine at the Beyond Dreaming Symposium convened by the Kluge-Ruhe, and he's pictured in the photograph on the left in the center, and Marge Bruchac, a scholar of Abenaki descent, at the Decolonizing the Digital Humanities Symposium, organized by Professors Alison Bigelow and Douglas Fordham. Mundine and Bruchac, plus other conference participants and organizers such as Elika Ortega-Guzman, Casey Keeler, and Peter Sutton, to name just a few of the people at each of those events, helped us to see that without sustained and meaningful collaboration with the communities at the heart of each project, we inflicted the type of discursive violence Rupika Risam has warned against. We inadvertently created colonial dynamics that undermined our intentions and reinforced the global north as the site of knowledge production, rather than truly centering and amplifying Indigenous knowledges and voices through each project. Oh, it looks like I got a little out of order here. Yeah. So in thinking about how to summarize both challenging yet rewarding experiences, I decided to focus more on our takeaways. In writing something like this, you realize just how much you have to say. So I want something clear to also give you all as a takeaway. And I've drafted those in the form of 8 guidelines for practicing a decolonial digital humanities, and practice being the operative word here. Some of these may seem really obvious, but actualizing a project is complex, and especially some of these can seem in opposition to the priorities of our academic departments or some of our academic departments. So first and foremost, listen, just do lots of listening, period. That was a big thing we learned. Second, establish a true collaboration. While adhering to cultural protocols, invite dialogue with key community members before embarking on a project, and do not move forward without their permission and participation. If working on a historical project, engage with living members of the community. 3, the projects need ample time and financial resources, so budget accordingly. Productive relationships are based on trust, which take years to establish. Never assume that anyone outside the university works on an academic calendar. Pay people for their time so as not to recreate the colonial conditions under which resources and knowledge were previously extracted. 4, do your homework by informing yourself about the local and historical conditions that will impact your project. 5, center and amplify the voices of those with whom you are working and those from their community. 6, create something that lasts beyond the end of the collaboration, like a book or a website, so your collaborators can continue to benefit from their own labor, and share it with others if they choose. But always be critical of the tools at your disposal. 7, get comfortable being uncomfortable and learn from your inevitable mistakes so that you can do better next time. And 8, revise your method for each future project based on engaged conversations with experts and your own experience. I've tried to do that now and apply these lessons to a digital project for the exhibition, Madain, 8 Decades of Aboriginal Bark Painting from Yirrkala, which is being collaboratively organized by the Buku-Larengi Mulka Center and the Kluge-Ruhe here in Charlottesville. Buku-Larengi is an Indigenous Australian community-controlled arts center located in Yirrkala, Australia, at the very tip of the top end of the Northern Territory. In other words, it's all the way up here. This is a small town and a remote community, primarily of Yolngu people, which is comprised of 12 clans hailing from different parts of the region. The exhibition, which has been years in the making, upends traditional museum hierarchies through its pioneering collaborative Indigenous and non-Indigenous curatorial team, which is being led by Indigenous curators, Jambu Amarawili, Wukan Wanambi, Yanimala Gumana, and Waka Muningur. And the exhibition catalog is also being authored by the Aboriginal Australian artists and curators themselves. Due to the pandemic, this is now going to open a little bit later in 2022 and travel to 3 US museums, not including the Kluge-Ruhe, unfortunately. So because of this existing collaboration and the longstanding relationships that exist between Yolngu leaders and the Kluge-Ruhe's Margot Smith and Henry Scarrett, a supplemental digital project is possible. It would not have been possible otherwise. The curatorial team has approved the idea for a digital timeline to be built collaboratively with members of the Mulka Project, a media lab founded in 2008 as part of Buku-Larengi Mulka Center, and that team is pictured here. Also, because of the conditions of the pandemic and the travel restrictions, I actually haven't had the privilege of being able to travel yet to Australia to meet the team, and so our work has actually been put on hold. And so a lot of this, a lot of the work I'm talking about is still kind of in the planning stage. It will be accessible in galleries and online, and I've just mocked up a really simple example of what it could potentially look like here. Using the new Story Map app in ArcGIS, each bark from the exhibition will be placed in relation to a specific time, as well as a specific place, and then activated by text and multimedia from the Mulka Center's archives. The resulting spatiotemporal map will attempt to interweave Indigenous Australian conceptions of time and space with Western understandings of linear time, thereby hopefully helping visitors to better understand bark painting from an Indigenous perspective. The Mapping Indigenous Worlds Lab, convened by Jim Igo and Max Edelson, and of course the Humanities Informatics Lab, are forums that have provided forums to learn about, and most importantly, to reflect upon and critique our methods and our tools, especially the digital mapping applications, which are by and large produced in the global north and have historically been wielded as tools of imperial and colonial violence. And so these interstitial university spaces and the people within them play such an important role as sites of learning that foster equitable action beyond the walls of the university. And I'll have to leave it there for now, but I thank you for your time and look forward to the discussion.
Eleanor, thanks so much. Fantastic talk. Okay, so we're on to our last speaker of the day, Allison Booth. Allison is professor of English and is academic director of the Scholars Lab and academic director of the Graduate Certificate in the Digital Humanities, as well as co-director of Humanities Informatics. One of her 3 books, How to Make It as a Woman, is the basis of her feminist DH project on gender and biography, Collective Biographies of Women, which has benefited from collaboration with many graduate students, including Brandon and Rennie. Allison, over to you.
Thank you, Phil. And I would love to be I'm going to leave to Yitna to do the weaving together of this wonderful range of talks. So I will be trying to be quick, and it's more of a kind of exhibit rather than a written paper. This is based on the work that has been supported by Humanities Informatics. So with this grant, I learned a hell of a lot from human-machine intelligence, from every other event I went to. I want to show just an example that is supported by Humanities Informatics money of working in digital humanities in a way that can sort of put your research and your teaching together in service of thinking against the grain of white supremacist US literary history. So I'll give you an example of that. And then don't worry, I'm not going to walk you through the syllabus, but the big data and life writing, I will give some samples of the syllabus of the course that I'm currently teaching online for the first time in my life, to teach online. And curiously finding it an opportunity to be very collaborative. It sort of seems to decenter the pedagogical structure just by everyone sitting in a pigeonhole. So very quickly, this is just a snapshot of a timeline on the Harlem Renaissance poet, Anne Spencer, whose papers are in the University of Virginia Special Collections, whose house museum is in Lynchburg, and it's one of the only African-American house museums. It's very distinctive to be an African-American writer's house museum preserved as well as it is. Her garden is also a monument of vernacular African-American garden design. So with a student in the LAMI program that Brandon spoke about, so a young woman from Puerto Rico, Aleshka Estevez, one summer, she and I pulled together our research, and with her technical skills and my technical skills, we did a whole story map exhibit on Anne Spencer that Eleanor mentioned, the story map device, but you can embed a timeline JS within that story map, and it's truly going to be interesting. This was a summer prototype, but we're still working on it in the Scholars Lab. So there's a program at the University of Virginia called USOR. It's undergraduate opportunity for advanced research. And for the second year in a row, a young man, Gideon French, and I will be working together, and he's going to be working with me on an Anne Spencer project with Beth Mitchell in the Scholars Lab, with the help of Humanities Informatics funding for Beth Mitchell's time, using not story maps, but Neatline, which is a software that Scholars Lab has developed with funding from NEH. It also uses maps and timelines in kind of synthesized digital humanities arguments. So I really value this opportunity to work with financial aid students, historically Black or Puerto Rican students. I learn from them, they learn from me, we co-author, they get equal credit to go and present at conferences. It's very much a model that I value about digital humanities. So the big data and life writing course that I'm teaching right now, just a screenshot of the start of the syllabus, intertwined themes, obviously big data and life writing. I am getting them sort of immersed in my sort of theme for my career in a way, prosopography or prosopography, sets of personae, it means personae writing, in collections, and I just am blind almost. I'm not subformal. I'm a formalist who sees form everywhere I look. Personae take many media, including collections of statues in public places, portraits with names in the National Portrait Gallery, but it can also mean a collection of biographies. So the media for representing individuals who in turn are presented as representative of traditions, cultural heritage, and nations. And I had a slide about Trump wanting to put himself on Mount Rushmore, but that would be a kind of national prosopography. What's wonderful about the course right now is the good fortune of it being a real diverse group of students, undergraduate and graduate, computer science, commerce school, English, Spanish. One was rather apologetic that she's in our OTC. And I said, please, please realize we're all here. PhD students in English and Spanish. Several of them are DH certificate students who've already worked with me, some of them. The very national origins just blew me away, and I didn't know all of the stories until their first paper includes Native American. People wrote about the crises they experience when asked to identify themselves. That was not the assignment. That was what they were getting from their readings. I did say, how do we, we did have discussion about what goes into an identification. How do we fill in a template to identify ourselves? How is that data collected? But the essays just blew me away. So I'm just putting arrows there on some key readings. This is just a sample of the kind of things that I used as kind of overview of the course to begin it, but the special issue of Journal Cultural Analytics on data. Jacqueline Wernemont, you'll see her again. There'll be 3 times she's mentioned in this session. Lauren Klein and Catherine D'Ignazio's Data Feminism, and of course the really notable Algorithms of Oppression by Sophia Noble. Just week 2, I just have highlighted or bolded some of the things we're doing. We do read some sort of 18th and 19th century autobiography, biography, thinking about the genres that include travel writing, slave narrative, Bildungsroman, autobiography, but then quite a bit of the sort of theoretical work. Fascinating to be thinking about Haraway, the manifesto of the Cyborg Manifesto, Catherine Hales, and absolutely Shoshana, Zuboff really sets the tone for thinking about surveillance capitalism. We have some guest speakers of our colleagues coming to class. There's a research project, but one of the ways I get them to be thinking about collective biography as prosopography is with my digital project, which Rennie Mapp was a project manager on. Brandon Walsh has helped me with in many ways. A number of graduate students have been co-authors of this. Worthy Martin, who's on this call, absolutely indispensable collaboration in the Institute for Advanced Technology in the Humanities. And this is just the public landing page, but I can say more about the CBW project another time. But then not to just think about books that publish series of biographies together, but think about public online reference works that collect portraits of people, personae that are essentially commensurate. And they're quantifying and quantifiable metadata about the biographies in something like biography.com, which if you look at the back end is an A&E network product. And they're just up front telling you, yeah, you might notice that you start getting recommendation, you actually get advertisements of various people who seem relevant to what you were searching for, advertisements for boots and advertisements for people of color. If you start looking for an African-American, you start getting biographies of African-Americans. You must be African-American. And inferences from your behavioral data input. We're all familiar with that kind of creepy self-portraiture when our browser tells us who they think we are. Did I say that? Wait, is that me? No, I know better than that. I can read through that advertisement, but I'm being shaped in this collaborative way. So that's just they're just explaining what you're experiencing when you're on biography.com. This is a slide from one of the PowerPoints in my class. Jackie Wernemont, and I took the snapshot, obviously, when fall 2020 novel coronavirus information at Arizona State University was framing absolutely appropriately a slide from an earlier exhibit by Elizabeth Grumbach and Jackie Wernemont. I love thinking about the ways people work around the sort of two-dimensional and borrowed from the social sciences or natural sciences ways we visualize data. And Jackie Wernemont is really a leader in rethinking that. So with this other artist, each chord in this installation represents, sorry, I've got people in front of my, it represents 12 deaths from the 1918 worldwide influenza pandemic, with black chords representing death certificates and gray chords representing oral histories. Part of the issue in Arizona would be that Native Americans weren't counted. So they're inferring the gray chords. And then they had sonification and they had other ways that the data could be represented. Prosopography, another medium in which thinking about data, about one person becoming part of a collective of many and measured alike. I have a thing about statues, and of course, this is when I say everything becomes news. You know, all fall we've been hearing about statues taken down, statues made into performance art. It never ceases to be timely. And of course, Charlottesville's recent 3 years of history with this is just truly relevant. And a collection of, you know, the whole United States, map of the United States of Confederate statues, even in places that weren't Confederate, makes a kind of prosopography which talks about the lost cause, and that is perfectly understandable. Here's a statue that will be built and will be the first real women represented in Central Park. And of course, what they've tried to do here is actually say it wasn't just white women working on suffrage. So it's an imaginary, it's a conversation piece in which all three of them sat or stood around a table planning together. We read Mary Seacole's Wonderful Adventures of Mary Seacole in Many Lands, and I've got a student working on her. But right up there in Britain, Mary Seacole was voted the greatest Black Briton, and she gets this enormous statue in front of St. Thomas's Hospital in London, and lots of newspaper articles about how pissed off they are. She wasn't really a nurse, she doesn't deserve, and she's made to rival the statue of Florence Nightingale, which is actually facing the, you know, a slightly different situation. She never worked at St. Thomas Hospital, et cetera, et cetera. But this is an important kind of argument in public memorial spaces that is prosopographical. Winding towards the end. So thinking about DH pedagogy, what I value about it is this collaborative, interdisciplinary humanities, the technological means to ask abiding and morphing questions. Obviously, DH pedagogy in non-pandemic times would rely a lot on technology, but even our research these days is all dependent on many aspects of technology. So in certain ways, we're all doing digital pedagogy and we're all doing digital research, but there's that added sort of dimension of the critical thinking about both the medium and the way we work. So questions about our concepts and our methods. Does adding to a commemorative list alter the terms of the collection? You add Mary Seacole to the National Collection of Statues of Women. Turns out most of the statues of women are either queens or nurses. Why are we so obsessive about statues of nurses? Never mind women of color. What are our categories, and how do, when we have a collection, do we really rework our representative values when we add or detract? If we took down all the Confederate statues or just said no more statues of white men, what would we get? Do we still want statues? Do we still want African American History Month to be a collection of celebrities? I mean, what's going on? So I find it very exciting not to be a total passive consumer of this kind of representation, but to think about the forms and the methods. And digital humanities is absolutely crucial for rethinking that kind of public biographical collection that we do. Would more data really help us? That's it.
Thanks so much, Allison. Well, let's have a round of applause for that collection of 6 fantastic and wonderful, wonderful talks. Wow. I've learned a lot in the last hour, so no question about it. And so with that in mind, I'll take the opportunity to invite a friend and collaborator, Jitna Ferdiewek, to the microphone, the virtual microphone, to offer perhaps some reflections and some connections and a question or two. Again, just as a reminder, if you have questions that you want to pose, please put them in the chat box. We have 1 or 2 waiting there already that we'll get to after hearing some of Jitna's words and perhaps some conversation among our presenters today. So Jitna Ferdiewek is, as I said, is instructional designer in the College of Arts and Sciences Learning Design and Technology Group. His work focuses on the intersection of content, pedagogy, and technology in the design of courses and curricula. And his most recent project involved the integration of e-portfolio literacy in the curriculum of language learning programs at UVA. His not most recent project, I should mention, is also as one of the directors of the university's Teaching and Technology Support Partner Program, which I participated in about 100 years ago, which Yitna ran back in the days when PowerPoint was a major disruptive force in teaching and pedagogy. So with that introduction, Yitna, I will turn it over to you. I know we're all eager to hear your reflections.
Thank you, Phil, and thanks for the reminder of where we started decades ago at the TTSP. Wow, this was, am I supposed to respond to this? That was sort of what was roiling in my head as I go. It's overwhelming. You guys are doing so much, and of course, as an instructional designer, our tendency is to create frameworks to understand sort of what's going on in a course. And so, as Phil mentioned in introducing me, content, pedagogy, and technology are sort of the elements that we try to work with whenever we're interacting with faculty in their programs. And of course, every single time I work with instructors, I'm always overwhelmed by the sort of depth of the content area, especially the interesting material that's involved. And of course, here I feel like I'm drinking from a fire hose of various materials like that. But nevertheless, the topic, the focus is pedagogy, digital humanities pedagogy. And I want to pause a little bit on that. I don't want to spend too much time because I think there are a lot of questions, and I'd rather the audience ask most of the questions. But in the context of thinking about content, pedagogy, and technology, and the balance between those three areas in our teachings, I think digital humanities pedagogy seems to be one of those rare instances where the three really come together. And I think it's worth noting that, because my sense is that as we come out of the pandemic and as we sort of reflect on what we have gone through in terms of this immersion in technology that we've all experienced, we might be better off answering one of the questions that Allison raised, which is what's the difference between digital pedagogy and teaching with technology? And I think it's probably a good time to start considering shifting away from discussing this as teaching with technology to digital pedagogy. I think this is sort of one of the aspects of my experience, my reaction to what I'm hearing here is that the digital pedagogy is really what we're engaged in, with the content kind of coming in from different angles and different sort of perspectives. The other aspect of it is that we're all engaged, of course, in skills, in developing skills, developing content knowledge, and developing attitude and sort of orientation towards what's going on. And I think that in each of your courses, I sense that there's sort of a push towards effecting a reaction towards the topic in the students, changing their attitude somehow it's an effective goal that's being attempted. And I think that's also a really powerful aspect to digital humanities pedagogy. So I looked at the questions that were listed in the description of the program. The emerging conditions of online pedagogy, we're facing a big part of that. Everything's online. Even digital humanities instructors are probably a bit surprised at the percentage of time, 100%, that things are becoming online. And in seeing some of those of you who are dealing with the materiality of your subject are probably feeling it the most, sort of being separated away from that. And I think that although at some point it'll change, maybe go back, but I don't think it'll be the same. We're going to have different reactions to this, to the pandemic and its effect on the way that we teach. The question that I wanted to sort of bring up and stop at and see how you respond to it is Brandon's text refers to digital humanities needs to be founded on a critical and engaged pedagogy that acts beyond the classroom. And so assuming that you agree with Brandon, and I'm pretty sure you do, but just assuming that, how does what each of you do in your course exemplify a critical and engaged pedagogy? And also, how does that engagement affect action beyond your classroom? And I mean really in concrete ways, not just doing what you did in the classroom outside of the students doing it outside of the classroom, but in a kind of a sort of a real transformative way. What do they take from your teaching out and live with and be with and have that sort of kind of a visceral presence in their lives after the class? So that's the question that I'm interested in. It has to do, it's centered around the students. So I'm asking, what is the life of your syllabus after the course? That's basically how it, I'd like to sort of put the question. And I'll stop there because I don't think we have very much time, and I'd like to make sure we have enough time for others to ask questions.
Just
so yeah, so with that, I'll just open it up to our panel and let you respond to Yitna's question. We have another specific question in the chat that we'll go to, and then perhaps we can just open it up for a few minutes to the audience. Right, there aren't so many of us here that will have chaos. So, but first, let's open it up to Yitna's question. I would love to hear our speakers today reflect and react to what Yitna just said. Allison?
Just really quickly, that's an excellent question. I would broadly say I've been motivated to involve myself in digital humanities in part because when I've worked with graduate students, they've helped me with my project, they've learned from my project. Obviously, I hope this is also true in a class, but when I've had research assistants on collective biographies of women, I've seen people go forward to getting really interesting jobs, like master's students who work in industry, or go on into journalism or working for the Rare Book School, or just really a variety of things. So the skills in research and in thinking about how technology can be used for communication directly translate into future careers. I sort of feel that it's in humanities pedagogy, a lot of the time you have this sort of delayed hope that they will go on and be better people. And I don't know, but certainly in the workshops, Humanities Informatics seems to me to have had a more sort of direct impact on people's choosing different paths through the academy, which is a very real life change.
Other thoughts?
I have a kind of pat answer, which is when I give students a fabrication assignment, they have something that they take away, which is an artifact that they've made, unlike an essay, and it becomes a kind of souvenir. But I don't know what the afterlife of those artifacts looks like, but I do like that when I give them back their essay, I can give them back something that they printed or cut or otherwise assembled, and they take that home.
So Worthy Martin posted a question. I happen to know that Worthy told us earlier he's on a chat only connection, so I will read his question for him. It's specifically for you, Brad. He says, Brad, does considering building blocks of different size, say 4 or 6 rather than 5, make a difference?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 5 is it's a kind of arbitrary choice. The shapes are interesting, and they have a kind of canonical status as they're interesting to people who do puzzles. But there are heptomenos and non-nominos, and I mean there are other ways to cut too that are not based on squares. The domino extended shapes. So no, it was an arbitrary decision we made because poetry is made up of kind of blank verse and sonnets, iambic pentameter is made up of 10 syllables and it has 5 feet. And so 5 felt like a number, and it mattered mystically as, like 5 fingers, and it's kind of, happy medium. But the CS students we were working with before the pandemic, we're trying to generalize the problem, and this makes it a CS research question, like given a poem, and then given a constraint like cut through 9 syllables and put them all in a piece. The program that they were designing that could do that was a hard problem, and it was an interesting question for the CS researchers, a hard problem for the undergraduates, and possibly a problem that could result in a research paper that could be given at a CS conference. So.
Excellent, thanks. Jack, you have a question.
Yes, thank you all for such great papers. So a question about, I guess this is really towards Eleanor and Brandon, but the question I guess I have is there something about digital humanities and the kind of practices that we have been sort of doing in the Humanities Informatics Lab that is more democratic or sort of more open to this kind of critical recuperative sort of pedagogy than other modes of pedagogy? And I'm thinking about this in contrast with the kind of claims that are being made, by Silicon Valley, which did make similar kind of democratizing claims about, or utopian claims about their work.
Did you want to go first, Eleanor?
I'll call on someone if I have to.
Yeah, I mean, so to think about it strictly in teaching terms, I think that might be true, just in the sense of like, just if you think about different kinds of teaching practices in terms of like lecturing versus discussion versus collaborative work versus like sage on the stage kind of stuff. Like, it seems like in the ways that Allison was alluding to, DH being in many cases so collaborative that it sort of is ready to welcome that kind of, like, even though that does of course still involve power relationships and can still be very anti-democratic, like it is almost in a certain way setting the stage for those kinds of engagements. And particularly I think if done well from like a real critical humanist standpoint, it does kind of invite the same sort of critique that can further elaborate on that way that would be more democratic. Though, I mean, not exclusively, can certainly be to that ends. But I don't know, what do you think, Eleanor?
Yeah, I mean, in thinking about my experience in 2 spaces specifically, one was very much kind of directly a DH space in the Scholars Lab, and the other was through the Kluge-Ruhe Aboriginal Art Collection, which really in a way has nothing to do with digital pedagogy at all, but we've then kind of found a way to connect those things together. So I think it is perhaps more that in each of those spaces, perhaps the pedagogical approach or the kind of critical tools that each employ there's a sort of ethos that connects to digital humanities, those sort of collaborative, more open approaches. And so I think there's something that they relate to, but it doesn't necessarily mean that those approaches are going to be democratic. There's a sort of reciprocal and critical process at play. And so I think we often choose to embrace that and try to do that in our digital humanities pedagogy, but I don't think they necessarily go hand in hand. I think it's a choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I might also just, Rennie, you can go for it.
Oh, and no, well, just to go back to the point of iteration, to me, iteration is very an ethos of allowing yourself to fail. And I'm not trying to allude to Silicon Valley, fail early, fail fast here, as much as I am to a kind of collaborative project of foregrounding the difficulties of humanistic inquiry and doing that in a group instead of by yourself upstairs in your office. That has it does have an affinity for other kinds of open-minded, collaborative, potentially public, potentially social justice oriented work. I don't think there's a necessary connection, but there is an affinity of that iterative willingness to accept that you're not going to get it right the first time, that connects with all those other efforts and open-mindedness, I think. But
yeah, I mean,
I would just chime in real quick that you know, it shouldn't just go unsaid that the notion of having something on a website does kind of put people in a little bit more of a sense of a public audience. It has been not, you know, Silicon Valley's dreams were not fulfilled. I fully grant you.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think, you know, you were using the term iterative, Rennie, and I think that's right. The term I was thinking about that I think is sort of like a Venn diagram overlapping with that one is like just reflection. So much of digital humanities being concerned with the process, reflecting on the process, documenting the process, thinking critically about the process, which I feel like is, like, as other people are saying, does not mean it's necessarily a democratic process, but it does share like affinities with that process and can set the stage for it.
So I actually have, I know we're a little bit over, but I actually have a couple questions that I would love to pose myself, if you're willing to entertain them. I mean, you know, one question is as we talked about before, you know, the title of this session is you know, Allison's play on words of emergent and emergency, right? I suppose. And so what I'm really trying to understand is what has emerged, you know, both during this time and through the work of this working group, that you will then really employ perhaps in new ways as we move forward with digital humanities pedagogy. So in other words, you know, this question that I have, which is, how will you take the kind of the results of this emergency and the things that you've learned, or perhaps the things you were working on before, and when things go back to normal, or whatever that is, right? I should say, when we are no longer forced to be in a constant physical separation from one another, how do you anticipate that things will change, or that you will employ these things in what will be the new normal moving forward in the next digital, you know, the next kind of iteration of the next phase of digital humanities pedagogy, if you will?
I'm just going to repeat how much I'm looking forward to eating with people again over digital humanities conversations. I just, that's not something that I want to take out of this, that kind of isolation. I hope that we'll still be able to do that. I'm sure we'll get, I think there's some great things about, you know, for our carbon footprints, et cetera. It's often been said that, you know, maybe that'll be a benefit for the earth, but I really think we need to go back to being together in a space as soon as we can.
Well, and for the point you made, Rennie, about the materiality of workshops, I mean, it really helps to be together when, you know, someone's installing this, you know, a group of RAs are installing the software on their laptops, or, you know, it's helpful. But there are definite conveniences. I mean, the disabled student who doesn't have to worry about how she gets to grounds, and you know, I'm not talking about a particular student. I'm just saying, generally speaking, everyone who has Wi-Fi and has a laptop, you know, which we can't take for granted, has a little more equal access. And, you know, presumably with recorded lectures, you know, you can do the closed captioning, you can do much more sort of accessibility. So there really are some cool things about this weird software we're all being made to conform to.
Yeah, and my second question, maybe it's a little bit more of a reflection than a question, and it's more closely related to what you all were just talking about in terms of sort of democratization and accessibility and so forth. You know, Brandon, I was struck by the quote that you read in your talk about and I can't remember exactly how it goes, you can refresh our memory, but about sort of what a lab is. You know, a lab is a space where we come to work together, right, against the you know, sort of the I can't remember what the term is, but right, the institution, like the inequities at the institution or whatever, to try to change the institution. You know, given what you were all saying and given where we are, it's interesting. It was really interesting hearing your talks, all of your talks, which had a real strong element of that playing out against this sort of backdrop of our current, you know, as your paper really talks about, Brandon, you know, against the backdrop, against slippage, if you will, you know, against democratization and against access and all of these things. How do you reflect largely, I mean, thinking outside of your own specific projects, how do you reflect on digital humanities generally during this kind of time, and what kind of a role you can see it playing in this current political and social milieu, if that makes sense?
I'll just jump in because of time. You know, other people are thinking. So I'm going to do the thoughtless thing. I feel that it's unimaginable how the world would be dealing without the pandemic, without data, and healthcare is unimaginable without some humanist critique of its constraints and delivery. It feels to me like, and the Black Lives Matter, you know, I had the students looking, you know, Black Lives Matter is based on Black Twitter. You know, this new technology includes just wonderful subjects for our research. People are scraping data from Twitter and understanding, you know, the demos is active, and how do we understand it? How do we hear it speak? We have new tools. So it's truly, you know, just open up the paper and so everything's relevant to the questions of big data and public commemoration, public preservation, what is our national heritage? So my course is just an example, but.
Sean Michael Morris he recently published a thing a couple of days ago. He's like one of my favorite people. And he said something like, you know, people like me who do critical instructional design used to be wallflowers to the academic project, and now we're like the most popular people with the dance, basically, is more or less what he was saying. Because I think he was getting at the idea that, you know, suddenly with like on such a large scale, so many people moving online, it, I think, made the work all the more relevant, and in not just through more people using them at technologies, but also laid bare a lot of economic and power structures that people might not otherwise been aware of. So like the idea of education technology and surveillance, and like video surveillance during teaching as a thing that is, you know, we're all swimming in. Suddenly people were posting about students who are getting these emails about how many times their eyes looked off the camera, and so they must be cheating, that sort of thing, which is like something that I think maybe might not have been like penetrated a larger social consciousness in the same way. So that might be my one response.
I'm kind of thinking about both of your questions, Phil, and wrestling with an answer to both of them. And I really was struck in all of our talks with how much people referred to doing in-person work, doing work together. So Brad's students building puzzle poetry together, or Rennie running these workshops. And for me, working with the Kluge-Ruhe, without making introductions in person in Yurkala, I cannot, you know, move forward without gaining trust of the people with whom I hope to work. And so certain digital projects you think you would be able to do very easily also really are predicated upon personal relationships and inhabiting a physical space together. And actually part of what the Kluge-Ruhe does that I think is so fantastic is Australia to Charlottesville, they spend all their time on Zoom planning these projects, but actually artists come over all the time for in-person residencies. And so I think this moment has made me realize how important it will be to continue to have these coeval practices of digital and in-person meetings. And so in thinking about those differences between kind of teaching with the digital and digital pedagogy, yes, we're going to continue to use these tools fail slowly rather than faster, learn from our mistakes, but also perhaps there's something in the ethos of digital humanities and some of these other intersecting fields where we think about that collaborative work, we think about access, we think about equitability, and perhaps we'll find ways to kind of work with our students or to teach ourselves to work beyond the virtual boundaries of our classrooms. I think this is a moment that's really outward looking, and so it provides even more opportunities to do that sort of like classroom to real world transition. And I'll be excited to see what people do with that.
Fantastic. Eleanor gets the last word. I think that was a lovely answer to the question and is precisely what I was trying to get at. So thank you so much. We need to be mindful of the time, especially because we are running up against 4 o'clock actually, and the last Humanities Informatics Showcase, which starts in about 10-15 minutes. So I just wanted to say thanks again to everyone for these wonderful inspirational talks. I think we learned a lot together here today. Thanks again for providing me the opportunity to moderate this discussion. I look forward to being part of more moving forward. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Enjoy the other workshop if you're heading that way, and have a great weekend. Bye, everyone.